I use the phrase ecstasy, which comes from the ancient Greek ekstasis. It literally means standing outside. An ecstatic experience is a moment where you go beyond your ordinary sense of self and reality and feel deeply connected to a power or intelligence greater than you. There are lots of other phrases for this domain of experience, like mystical experience, spiritual, religious experience, peak experience, altered state of consciousness, trance states, and so on. But I like this phrase, ecstatic experience. Now, ecstatic sounds like very, very happy. And it's true that ecstatic experiences can be euphoric, but they can also be terrifying. They can be healing, but they can also be destructive and harmful to yourself and to others. Because they are somewhat wild experiences out of control, by their nature, you are surrendering control. And because of that, cultures over history have developed rituals, containers, controlled containers in which people can lose control. And they have ecstatic rituals for various different motives, for healing, to help people find meaning, connection to other people or to nature or to the gods, and also just for fun, because it's rather boring to be stuck in our little egos most of the time. As Aldous Huxley put it, humans have a basic urge to self-transcendence. And you can see, looking at other cultures and other moments in history, how they've developed strong ethical and cultural containers and strict rules for ecstatic experiences. Like, for example, the Eleusinian mysteries, which existed for 2,000 years in ancient Greece. This is one of the central kind of ecstatic rituals at the heart of ancient Greek culture, in which participants or initiates had a kind of mystical experience that may have been psychedelically prompted. We don't know. There were all kinds of rituals and rules around the Eleusinian mysteries. You had to prepare, you had to fast, you had to take part in a procession to Eleusis. Certain people were excluded if you committed terrible crimes, for example, and then you weren't allowed to speak about the experience afterwards or break the rules afterwards. There was a famous Athenian general called Alcibiades, and he took some of the aspects of the Eleusinian ritual and used them at a dinner party. This may have been the first psychedelic dinner party in history, and he was banished from Athens for breaking the rules. So it was very serious and strict rules. Or if you look at Christian culture, the medieval church had a very central place for ecstatic experiences, but it exerted strict controls and rules over ecstasy. You could only indulge in Christian ecstatic practices. All other practices were deemed heretical. And if you said, "I've had an ecstatic experience, God has spoken to me," it could go one of two ways in Christian culture. You could be seen as a prophet and given tremendous charismatic authority, like Joan of Arc, the peasant girl. But you could also be seen as a heretic, as demonically possessed, and end up being burned, like Joan of Arc. So it was somewhat risky to say, "I've had an ecstatic experience" in medieval culture. Nonetheless, there was a place for it. What happened then in the 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries was the Reformation. This was like a bomb going off, and suddenly the church didn't have a monopoly over ecstatic experiences, and all kinds of people and all kinds of groups claimed direct ecstatic experiences, claimed direct union with the divine. And this was both empowering, but it was also incredibly destabilizing. It led to the wars of religion in the 16th and 17th century, in which a third of the population of Germany died, for example. You had all kinds of ecstatic cults led by these prophets who declared they were divine or the Messiah and so on. So this gave religious ecstasy a bad name. It was seen as disruptive to politics and dangerous. So what happened then from the 17th century onwards was religious ecstasy started to be marginalized and seen as a dangerous and stupid thing. So this is a drawing by Goya called "The Sleep of Reason Produces Monsters." So it was seen that religious ecstasy, what happens when people, think that angels are talking to them or that they're connecting to God, is really they're just letting their imagination carry them away. They're seeing things or hearing things that aren't real. So Western culture moved to a more rationalistic, materialist, self-controlled, and capitalist form of society. And religious ecstasy didn't have much place in that modern form of society. What happened in the 19th and 20th centuries was this new discipline called psychiatry deemed religious ecstasy as delusional. People like Henry Maudsley, Sigmund Freud, Jean-Martin Charcot, these kind of fathers of psychiatry, all of them they tended to be atheist, anti-Christian, and they said religious ecstasy is just an illness, it's a delusion. This lady here is a patient of Jean-Martin Charcot in a asylum in Paris in the late 19th century. And Charcot would put his patients in these kinds of religious postures and take photos of them, and then use this as evidence that religious ecstasy is actually a brain disorder. So Charcot was vehemently atheist, like most psychiatrists, and he said religious ecstasy is actually a symptom of brain pathology. And Socrates and Muhammad and Jesus, they were all actually suffering from some kind of brain disorder. So there's been this marginalization of ecstatic experiences in Western culture. But of course, there have been countercurrents over the last few centuries, attempts to find a new place for the ecstatic in Western culture. For example, ecstatic Christian movements like Methodism in the 18th and 19th centuries, and Pentecostalism, which has been the fastest growing religious movement of the last century or so. Something like 1,000 people convert to Pentecostalism every day. But these ecstatic Christian movements, though they found a place for things like trance states, ecstatic states, but they were rather marginal. They were rather looked down on by Western intellectuals and dismissed as just, happy, clappy Christianity. Then you also have movements like Romanticism and New Age culture. They also try to find a positive place for ecstatic experience, for trance states. But these, before the 60s, were rather kind of minority cultures. What I mean by that, they were just bohemians. They were not part of mass culture. Now, that changed in the 1960s. From my point of view, the 1960s was a kind of mass ecstatic awakening, a kind of mass bohemianism, when some of the ideas and practices which had been confined to just the bohemian elite in the 1920s became adopted by mass numbers of people. So you had, all kinds of new avenues to the ecstatic in the 1960s. The sexual revolution, the psychedelic revolution, the rock and roll revolution, also this explosion of Eastern contemplative practices into Western culture. And ecstatic Christianity was also a big part of the 1960s. So you can see that the number of people who said they had a religious or mystical experience starts to rise from the 1960s. It's about 20% of people in 62, and by 10 years ago, it's about 50% of people. And I would think in the last few years, it's kept on rising even more steeply. So today, something like 12% of Americans practice yoga and different forms of meditation, and 6% say they've taken psychedelics in the last year. And that number for psychedelic usage has tripled in the last decade. So we're part of this psychedelic renaissance today. and more people are taking psychedelics for fun, for healing, for spiritual exploration. However, we don't yet have settled maps and guides and rituals and agreed interpretations or ethical rules for ecstatic experiences. These are still quite new in our culture. It takes decades or centuries to evolve settled cultural habits around ecstatic experiences. And so it's going to be a long, messy process to reintegrate ecstatic experiences into Western culture. And in the meantime, I think we're still an ecstatically naive culture. So how can we develop ecstatic literacy and ecstatic maturity, greater maturity in how we relate to this domain of human experience?